In the luxurious calm of an airport boarding gate, a storm brews. A racist flight attendant dismisses an elderly black woman with arrogance, belittling her presence before shocked passengers. Yet, the woman's calm dignity, her silence, and one symbolic gesture transform the moment, ending with a cliffhanger that hints at her hidden power. "We don't serve people like you in first class." The words cut through the polished air of the boarding gate like a slap, sharper than the shuffle of boarding passes or the hum of the rolling suitcase wheels. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered. The luxury lounge's gold-trimmed sign gleamed above, as if mocking the insult hurled at the frail woman who stood alone at the gate. She was small, shoulders slightly bent with age, her silver hair braided, neatly beneath a soft hat. In her hand, she clutched a boarding pass, creased but firm, her thumb pressing into the corner like it held the last piece of her dignity. The flight attendant who stood before her, tall, crisp uniform, red lipstick, painted into a sneer, didn't lower her voice. She wanted the audience. She wanted the smirks, the murmurs, the casual nods of approval from those who agreed but didn't dare to say it aloud. Her arrogance dripped into the polished tiles, staining the air. "First class is for paying passengers," the attendant went on, flicking her eyes toward the elderly woman's worn shoes. "Not charity cases." The crowd shifted. A businessman pretended to check his phone but lingered. A young couple froze mid-conversation, their smiles melting. Silence pooled. Heavy, oppressive. The woman inhaled slowly, steady as a mountain. Her eyes, dark and clear, carried a history of storms weathered long before this gate, this insult, this uniformed arrogance. She didn't argue, she didn't beg. She simply held out her boarding pass, the bold letters printed in black and undeniable. "First class." The attendant's lip curled. She snatched the pass from the woman's fingers, the paper tearing slightly under her grip. That was the symbolic action. A rip, subtle but loud, meant to humiliate. The sound of tearing paper echoed like thunder in the silence. Passengers gasped. A child tugged his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why is she being mean?" The woman's calm never wavered. Her hand, now empty, dropped gently to her side. Her voice, when it came, was soft but resonant, carrying more weight than a shout ever could. "You can tear the paper," she said, her tone like a hymn whispered in a cathedral. "But you can't tear my place." The attendant blinked, her painted face stiffening. The power shifted, subtly, invisibly, but undeniably. The woman stepped forward, not begging, not pleading, simply moving as though the torn boarding pass meant nothing. And then, as the doors to the jet bridge opened, her eyes flickered. Not to the seats of the airplane, not to the sneering attendant, but beyond, toward something unseen. Passengers leaned closer, sensing the moment. What was she hiding? Who was she, really? Her lips curved, almost imperceptibly, into a knowing smile, and with that, she said nothing more, only whispering one line that froze the air around her. "You'll soon learn who owns this sky." The attendant's confidence faltered, her smile cracking for the first time. Cliffhanger. The gate beeped, signaling a call from the captain, one that would change the course of this flight forever. The boarding chime sang its polished tone, and the passengers filed onto the jet bridge like streams merging into a single river. The elderly woman stepped forward slowly, her shoulders straight despite the sting of humiliation still echoing from the gate. The torn boarding pass, now rescanned and begrudgingly returned by the attendant, trembled in her fingers. Not from fear, from restraint. "Keep moving," the flight attendant snapped, her eyes darting to the nearby passengers who still lingered with curiosity. She wanted control again. Her lips twisted into a cruel half-smile. "First class isn't a sightseeing tour," murmurs stirred in the line. Why would she say that? whispered a young woman clutching her tote bag.
Just let it go,
Her partner muttered, tugging her arm.
it's not our business.
The silence of complicity seeped into the air, thick and suffocating. Inside the cabin, the first-class seats gleamed under the soft golden lights. Wide leather armchairs stretched luxuriously across the aisle, while champagne flutes on polished trays caught the glow like jewels. This was a world carefully designed to say, "You've earned this space." And yet, as the elderly woman stepped into it, the atmosphere shifted. A businessman in a navy suit frowned, pulling his briefcase closer. A middle-aged woman in pearls glanced at the attendant, then at the elderly woman, and offered a thin, polite smile that barely masked her discomfort. The attendant followed, her heels striking the carpet like the march of entitlement. She leaned closer to the woman's ear, her whisper sharp enough to slice. "Don't get too comfortable," she hissed. "People notice when someone doesn't belong." The elderly woman lowered herself gracefully into her seat. She placed her small leather bag neatly by her feet, adjusted the fold of her cardigan, and simply looked out the window. Calm, silent, dignified, but then one small symbolic act. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old worn journal, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed but alive with notes, dates, and signatures. She placed it on the tray table gently, as though setting down a crown. The businessman, 2 seats away, glanced at it. His brow furrowed when he noticed the embossed initials in gold. EA passengers whispered again, louder this time. "Who is she?" "She looks important somehow." "No, she's just old. The attendant's right. Probably used points." But one child across the aisle, curious, innocent, leaned over and whispered to his mother,
She looks like a queen.
The woman turned her head then, and for the first time since the insult at the gate, her eyes met the flight attendant's. Calm, unbothered, and with a quiet intensity that unsettled the uniformed arrogance in front of her. She spoke only once, her voice a steady hum. "You can't lock dignity out of a cabin." The attendant's face stiffened. She forced a brittle laugh and walked briskly toward the galley, heels clicking faster now, her shoulders tense. Passengers exchanged looks. Some disapproved, some shrugged. But the whispers were alive now, moving like sparks through dry air, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, no one yet realized that those sparks would ignite a fire powerful enough to upend the sky itself. The engines roared as the aircraft shuddered upward, piercing the clouds with a steady climb. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the seatbelt sign blinked overhead, its gentle chime swallowed by the hush of expectation. The elderly woman sat upright, hands folded neatly on her lap, her gaze fixed out the oval window. Her eyes followed the rising sun, golden light spilling over the endless horizon. Across the aisle, the businessman stole glances at her journal, the cracked leather catching the faint reflection of dawn. He shifted in his seat, uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. The flight attendant returned, tray in hand, her posture crisp, her smile weaponized. She moved with the grace of someone who believed the cabin belonged to her alone. Setting a glass of champagne before each passenger, she lingered last at the elderly woman's seat. "For you." Her voice slid like ice. Instead of champagne, she placed a small plastic cup of water, the rim smeared, the liquid lukewarm. "Compliments of economy." A ripple of quiet gasps traveled through the cabin. One man's jaw tightened, but he looked away. A woman pressed her lips together, uncomfortable but silent. The elderly woman lowered her eyes to the cup. For a moment, silence expanded, thick, suffocating. Then, with a steady hand, she lifted the water. The cup shook faintly, not from weakness, but from the engine's vibration. She raised it to her lips, took one small sip, then placed it down firmly. Then came the symbolic act. She reached for the journal again, opened it slowly, and slid a folded, paper onto the tray. A boarding document, faded, creased, but still legible. Across the top, in bold black letters, "First class, paid in full." Passengers leaned closer. The businessman's eyes narrowed. The young mother across the aisle whispered, "She bought her ticket." "Why's the attendant treating her like this?" The attendant's jaw stiffened. She bent low, hissing so only the woman could hear. "You think paper means you belong here? These people," she gestured subtly toward the polished passengers, "don't care what's printed on it. They see what you are." The woman's gaze lifted, calm as ever, her voice carrying just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've seen many papers in my life," she said softly. "Contracts signed to chains, laws written to silence voices, but ink fades and truth remains." The words landed like a tremor. The businessman shifted, suddenly uncomfortable in his luxury seat. The young mother's hand tightened protectively on her child's arm. The attendant's mask of arrogance cracked, just slightly, her smile faltering, as she straightened and walked briskly back toward the galley. Her heels struck harder now, betraying nerves. And then the turbulence came. The plane jolted, trays rattling, champagne spilling in golden splashes across white tablecloths. Passengers gasped, clutching armrests. The elderly woman didn't flinch. She closed her journal, slid it back into her bag, and folded her hands once more. When the shaking stilled and the captain's voice soothed over the intercom, all eyes returned to her. She was steady, unshaken, like the turbulence had revealed something. Not about the plane, but about the hierarchy that was beginning to tilt. The whispers grew louder now. Why is she so calm? She doesn't look afraid at all. She's not what they think she is. The woman turned to the window again, watching the horizon. The clouds parted, sunlight flooding in like revelation, and with it, the first seeds of doubt bloomed in the hearts of those who had once stayed silent. The cabin had settled into that suspended quiet that only came at 30,000 feet, soft hum of engines, muted conversations, the occasional clink of cutlery against fine china. Yet beneath the stillness, tension brewed, invisible but palpable, like static before lightning. The elderly woman sat motionless, her back straight, hands resting gently on her folded cardigan. Her face turned toward the window, though her reflection in the glass betrayed nothing but serenity. The flight attendant, however, could not rest. Her movements grew sharper, her smiles thinner. She felt the eyes on her, the ones that had gasped when she placed water instead of champagne, the ones that whispered when the old boarding document was revealed. Her authority, once absolute, now wavered under scrutiny. She returned down the aisle, silver tray in hand, this time offering dinner menus. She moved gracefully through the row, presenting them like sacred texts, until she reached the elderly woman. Then, with a calculated pause, she placed a wrinkled napkin on the tray table instead. "No menu for you," she said softly, but with enough bite for nearby passengers to hear. "We only serve what's available to guests like you." The businessman in the navy suit flinched. The young mother gasped quietly, pressing her child's hand. Even a flight attendant from economy, passing through first class with a service cart, hesitated, her eyes flicking between the two women, uncertainty breaking through the professional mask. The elderly woman didn't reach for the napkin. She let it sit there, crumpled and empty. Instead, she lifted her hand and gently traced the condensation on her untouched water cup, circling it slowly, as if drawing time itself. The symbolic action hung heavy in the air. She would not eat their crumbs. Her voice came, steady and soft, like a melody carried on the hum of the engines. "You cannot starve someone who has already been fed by endurance." The businessman coughed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His fork scraped the edge of his plate, though he hadn't taken a bite. The Pearls woman lowered her menu, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting toward the elderly woman, then quickly, away, as if she was beginning to feel shame but lacked the courage to voice it. It was the young mother who broke the silence. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She raised her hand slightly as though still in a classroom. "Isn't she a first-class passenger too? Shouldn't she be treated the same?" The words cracked open the silence like glass shattering. Heads turned. The businessman avoided eye contact. The Pearls woman inhaled sharply, then reached for her champagne with shaking hands. The flight attendant's smile stiffened, her eyes flashing with annoyance. She leaned down, her tone sharpened. "Ma'am, please enjoy your meal and allow me to manage the cabin. Some people don't understand the standards here." The elderly woman finally turned her gaze from the window. Her eyes met the attendant's squarely. Calm, piercing, unflinching. Her voice was quieter than a whisper, yet everyone near leaned in to hear. "Standards fall with the ones who enforce them." The young mother's eyes widened. The child beside her whispered, "She talks like a leader." The businessman set down his fork, no longer able to eat. The Pearls woman shifted, visibly conflicted. The attendant, rattled, forced a brittle laugh and straightened her back. "Enjoy your view," she muttered before storming back toward the galley, her heels hammering into the carpet. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, full. Passengers exchanged glances, not all supportive, not all brave, but curious. The tide was beginning to turn, however slowly. The elderly woman returned her gaze to the horizon, where the sky was bleeding into night. The hum of the engines deepened, steady, endless, and for the first time a quiet murmur spread across first class, not about her exclusion, but about her presence. She doesn't look afraid. She looks in control. Who is she? The silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of anticipation. The dinner service clinked on. Silverware gleamed under soft cabin lights, but the mood was anything but serene. Conversations were hushed, fragmented, punctuated by glances toward seat 2A, where the elderly woman sat, still as stone, her presence commanding more attention than the food being served. The flight attendant emerged from the galley, her uniform flawless, her posture sharp as a blade, but her eyes betrayed agitation. She could feel her control slipping, thread by thread, and she would not let it unravel without a fight. She paused by the elderly woman's seat, tray in hand. Instead of the plated salmon offered to the others, she placed a small plastic pack of crackers onto the tray table. Its cellophane wrapper crinkled harshly in the quiet cabin. "Dinner is served," she announced, her voice a little too loud, eyes darting to the passengers around her as if seeking approval. A ripple of discomfort passed through the rows. The businessman set down his fork with a sharp clink. The Pearls woman let out a faint gasp. The young mother pressed her lips into a thin line, her child staring wide-eyed at the scene. The elderly woman didn't reach for the crackers. She simply looked at them, then slowly pushed them aside, untouched. She lifted her journal again, opened it, and rested it across her lap. Her calmness mocked the cruelty more effectively than outrage ever could. The young mother couldn't hold back. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time. "That's not right. Everyone else got a full meal. Why does she get crackers?" The attendant's smile was tight, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Because not everyone can handle the richness of our service. I'm protecting her." The businessman coughed sharply. "That's nonsense. She's paid for the same seat as we did." Passengers shifted, murmuring. Some nodded, others avoided. Eye contact, unwilling to be pulled into confrontation. The Pearls woman spoke next, her voice trembling but clear. "She deserves respect. This isn't how first class is supposed to work." The attendant's mask cracked. Her lips tightened, her voice dropped to a hiss. "Do you want to fly this plane for me? Do you want to do my job? You don't know what she's like. People like her always—" She stopped herself, but it was too late. The phrase, "people like her," hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. A silence heavier than the engines swallowed the cabin. The elderly woman finally closed her journal, her hands resting lightly on its cover. She lifted her gaze, not at the attendant, but at the passengers. Her eyes swept over them. Businessmen, mothers, strangers united by altitude and fate. Her voice, soft but commanding, filled the silence. Cruelty speaks loudly. Dignity speaks quietly. "Which one lasts longer in your memory?" the child whispered. "Dignity." The businessman nodded faintly, his jaw clenched. The Pearls woman lowered her eyes, ashamed. The attendant stood frozen, her face pale beneath her makeup. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She spun on her heel and marched toward the galley, her heels clattering like failing drums. The cabin stirred alive with whispers, no longer just discomfort, now debate. "She's right." Unbelievable behavior from staff. "Well, maybe the attendant had a point." No, that was plain cruelty. The divide was drawn. First, class no longer felt like luxury. It felt like a courtroom, with one elderly woman as both witness and judge. She sat back in her seat, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. Not asleep, not retreating, simply resting, as though she knew time itself was on her side. But even as the hum of the engines smoothed into steady rhythm, unease settled deep in the cabin. For if this woman could dismantle arrogance with only calm words, what else was she capable of? The cabin hummed with unease, not conversation. Forks rested untouched on linen cloths. Champagne fizzed flat in forgotten flutes. Every passenger knew something was unraveling, but no one could predict how far the thread would pull. From the galley, the flight attendant peeked out, her hands gripping the counter edge so tightly her knuckles whitened. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, judging, questioning, whispering. Her authority, once as polished as her uniform, now hung by a thread. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been made aware of some concerns in the first-class cabin. I'll be stepping in shortly to ensure everyone is comfortable." The attendant froze. Her chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. Reports weren't supposed to travel this fast, especially not to the captain himself. The businessman leaned back in his seat, murmuring, "Finally." The Pearls woman set her glass down, hands trembling. The young mother whispered to her child, "See, someone's coming to help." The elderly woman didn't move. Her hands rested calmly atop her journal, her face serene as if she'd foreseen this moment long before takeoff. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and the captain entered, broad-shouldered, uniform neat, voice calm but carrying authority. His presence shifted the air. He wasn't just a pilot. He was the voice of the flight itself. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his eyes sweeping the cabin. The flight attendant straightened immediately, her smile snapping back into place. "Captain, everything is under control. There was a small misunderstanding with a passenger. Nothing more." Murmurs stirred. The businessman scoffed audibly. The young mother's lips parted in disbelief. Even the Pearls woman shook her head faintly. The captain frowned. His eyes fell on the elderly woman sitting in 2A, quiet, dignified, untouched crackers still on her tray. "Ma'am," he said gently. "Have you been mistreated?" The attendant quickly cut in. "No, Captain. She's simply confused about her seating and meal service. It happens sometimes." "Confused?" the businessman snapped, unable to hold back. "She was insulted in front of all of us. She was denied champagne, denied a meal, and told she didn't belong here." The young mother nodded quickly. Yes, it wasn't confusion. It was cruel. The cabin erupted in low voices. Support, doubt, outrage, unease. The division grew sharper, louder. The captain raised a hand, silencing the noise. His gaze turned back to the elderly woman. "Is this true?" The woman finally opened her eyes. Her gaze was calm, deep as a still lake, carrying decades of storms, weathered and endured. She did not raise her voice. She simply reached into her journal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it slowly, her hand steady, and placed it on the tray. It wasn't a boarding document this time. It was a shareholder's certificate, crisp, official, with the airline's embossed seal glinting under cabin lights. Her initials, EA, were printed in elegant script at the bottom. Gasps filled the cabin. The businessman leaned forward, eyes widening. The Pearls woman's hand flew to her mouth. Even the captain blinked, his calm faltering for a fraction of a second. The attendant's breath caught in her throat. The woman's voice, soft and steady, carried through the stunned silence. "I know the air that carries this plane," she said. "I paid for this seat long before I ever stepped on board." Her words were not loud. They didn't need to be. The cabin was silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of complicity. It was the silence of revelation. The captain straightened, clearing his throat. He nodded once, respectfully, before turning toward the attendant. "Join me in the galley. Now." The attendant's face drained of color. She hesitated, her legs stiff, before finally following him, her heels clicking faintly like the last beats of a broken drum. The passengers remained frozen, caught between awe and unease, and the elderly woman, serene as ever, looked back out the window, her reflection illuminated by the endless night sky. Calm, waiting, inevitable. The galley door clicked shut, and for a moment, the cabin exhaled. Conversations that had been stifled spilled into the air like sudden wind. "I knew it," the businessman muttered, half to himself. "She has shares," whispered the Pearls woman, her eyes darting toward the elderly woman in seat 2A. The young mother shook her head in quiet awe. "Not just shares. She carries herself like she built this airline." The elderly woman sat unmoved, her eyes returning to the dark ocean of clouds beyond the window. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, as though the weight of revelation was nothing new to her. In the galley, voices clashed, muffled but tense. The captain's firm, controlled tone rose, while the attendant's words cracked with panic. Bits leaked through the thin partition. "She's nobody. You disrespected a shareholder. I was protecting standards. You were humiliating a passenger." The door opened again, and the captain emerged, his jaw set, his posture rigid. The attendant followed behind, her shoulders tense, her once crisp smile erased. She avoided the passenger's eyes, shrinking in the very space she once dominated. The captain addressed the cabin, his voice calm but edged with finality. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for any discomfort. We assure you this airline treats all passengers with dignity and respect. It was the kind of polished corporate line designed to smooth over cracks. But this time it wasn't enough." The businessman raised his hand slightly, his voice sharp. "Captain, dignity and respect weren't shown. We all saw it." The Pearls woman nodded, finding her courage. This wasn't just discomfort. It was discrimination. The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded once, acknowledging what couldn't be hidden. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, the weight of every pair of eyes pressing on. Her like chains, her arrogance had drained away, leaving her brittle, exposed. And then came the symbolic act. The elderly woman reached into her bag once more, not for the journal this time, but for something folded in soft fabric. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently, until a small silver pin glimmered under the cabin lights. It was the airline's founding insignia, dated decades earlier, an emblem long retired, known only to those who understood the company's roots. The businessman inhaled sharply. The Pearls woman gasped aloud. Even the captain's composure faltered, recognition flashing in his eyes. The woman held it in her palm, her voice steady, quiet, undeniable. This airline was built on the backs of those who were never invited. Into first class. My husband flew its first international route. My family carried its weight through storm and sky. And yet here I sit, treated as less than a passenger. Her words didn't thunder. They resonated. They wrapped around the cabin, like truth long denied, now undeniable. The young mother's eyes welled with tears. She whispered, "She's history itself." The attendant's face drained, her lips trembling. I didn't know," she stammered. The woman's gaze turned toward her, steady as stone. "That is the cost of arrogance. You never see what is in front of you." Silence swept the cabin again, heavier than ever. But it was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of reckoning. The captain lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect that few had ever seen him give mid-flight. He cleared his throat, his voice softer. "Ma'am, would you allow us the honor of serving you properly?" The woman closed her hand over the pin and returned her gaze to the stars outside. She didn't answer with words, only with a slight nod. Graceful, dignified, enough to send a ripple of shame through the uniform beside him. The flight attendant, once so towering, now seemed impossibly small. Her heels no longer struck the carpet with confidence. They shuffled, heavy, each step dragging under the weight of humiliation. And the passengers, once divided, leaned ever closer to the woman in 2A, sensing that her story was far from finished. The sky stretched endlessly outside, but inside the cabin the walls felt tight, pressed in by truths that could no longer be ignored. The atmosphere inside the cabin had transformed. The once divided rows of strangers were now united, bound together not by fear of turbulence, but by a sense of shared awakening. The elderly woman sat quietly in her seat, but the energy around her had shifted. Passengers leaned forward slightly, some offering soft smiles, others with eyes that carried respect. She hadn't asked for reverence. It simply gravitated toward her. The young mother leaned across the aisle. "Ma'am," she said gently, "would you like some water? I can get it for you." The woman gave a small nod of thanks, but before the mother could move, the captain himself gestured to a nearby crew member. "I'll handle it." His voice carried not authority this time, but something closer to duty. He took a glass of sparkling water from the trolley and approached seat 2A with steady hands. "Please accept this. From the airline. With respect." The woman accepted it gracefully, raising it just slightly before setting it down on her tray table. She did not drink. Yet, the gesture itself was enough. Across the aisle, the Pearls woman muttered under her breath, half in awe, half in guilt. "We all sat here and watched her be humiliated." The businessman responded in a low tone, his jaw tight. "And now, we're watching her restore dignity without raising her voice once." Meanwhile, the attendant stood frozen near the galley. Her hands fidgeted with the edges of her uniform, nails biting into fabric. Every attempt at composure failed, the trembling in her lips, the darting of her eyes, the tightening of her throat. One passenger finally broke the tension. The young man in row 4 leaned forward, his voice carrying. "Why did you treat her that way?" Heads turned. Eyes locked onto the attendant. Her lips parted, but the words stumbled out awkwardly. I was following procedures," the businessman snapped, his patience gone. "Don't hide behind rules. We saw you. That wasn't procedure. That was prejudice," the Pearls woman added, her voice sharper now. "You sneered at her bag. You questioned her place. Admit it." The attendant's breathing quickened. Her gaze flicked to the captain, pleading silently for rescue, but his expression remained firm, neutral. He wasn't shielding her anymore. Her mask cracked. "I didn't mean," she began, voice breaking. But before she could continue, the elderly woman spoke at last. Her words cut through the tension like a blade. "You meant every word. The problem is, you thought they would vanish into the air, like every insult spoken at 30,000 feet. The attendant's face flushed, crimson. Tears rimmed her eyes, but no one reached to comfort her. The woman continued, her tone calm but commanding. "Do you know why I fly this airline? Not because of luxury, not because of comfort, but because every mile I sit in these seats, I remember the years my husband gave to build it. I remember the men and women who worked the runways, the mechanics, who kept the planes alive, the crews who carried hope across oceans, and I see how quickly their labor is disrespected by arrogance in uniform." A murmur rippled through the passengers. Her words had peeled away the last layers of pretense. The captain's throat tightened as he realized the depth of her truth. He glanced at the silver pin on her tray table, the emblem of a history he had only read about. His respect deepened, mingled with shame. The young mother whispered to her child, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "This woman isn't just flying with us. She is the airline." And suddenly, it clicked. Passengers began to understand. The woman wasn't merely a shareholder. Her roots were foundational. Her presence here wasn't chance. The attendant's breath hitched as the realization dawned on her, too. She had mocked someone tied not just by money but by blood, by legacy, by history. Her knees nearly buckled, but she steadied herself against the galley wall, her voice barely audible. I didn't know who she was." The woman's gaze lifted, piercing. And that is precisely the failure. You should not need to know someone's name to offer them respect. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. The hum of the engines filled it like a drumbeat of truth. For the first time, the flight attendant lowered her head, not in false deference, but in defeat. The sky outside remained endless, but inside the cabin, something had shifted forever. The cabin had become a courtroom in the sky. The rows of leather seats, the soft golden light overhead, and the steady hum of the engines set the stage for judgment. And for once, it wasn't the uniform that dictated authority. It was the collective, conscience of those on board. The elderly woman remained seated, calm as a mountain at dawn. Her presence radiated control, though she spoke little. Her silence had turned into a mirror, reflecting the passengers' own unease back at them until they could no longer ignore it. The young man in row 4 stood first. "I watched the way you grabbed her ticket," he said, his voice firm. "You didn't treat her like a passenger. You treated her like she didn't belong." The Pearls woman nodded, finally raising her voice. "And we let you. We watched. But no more." One by one, voices rose. The businessman, once aloof, admitted, "I didn't speak up earlier because it was easier not to, but she deserves better. We all do." The young mother, her child curled against her side, added softly, "My daughter is watching. She's learning what power looks like. And I want her to see that arrogance collapses." Each word was a stone, placed on the scale, tipping it further, heavier, against the attendant. The attendant stood near the galley, her posture rigid but her composure gone. Her mascara smudged under her eyes, her lips trembling as she tried to hold her ground. "You don't understand," she whispered, desperate. "I was following—" "Enough!" The captain's voice cut sharp, final. All eyes turned toward him. His jaw was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. For the first time, he faced her not as her superior, but as a man stripped of excuses. "Don't insult us by hiding behind procedure. This was never about the rules. This was about prejudice." The attendant flinched, her last shield shattered. The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice low but carrying. When arrogance breaks, it does not shatter quietly, it echoes. The words lingered, heavy, filling the space like smoke. Passengers exchanged glances, each realizing they had been part of something larger, an unveiling, a reckoning. The captain bowed his head slightly toward the elderly woman. On behalf of this airline, and as its servant in uniform, I owe you an apology. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. We failed you. The woman inclined her head, dignified, but said nothing more. Her silence was not weakness, it was judgment. The attendant's breath quickened, panic setting in. She looked from face to face, searching desperately for an ally, but every gaze that met hers was filled with cold accountability. No one? She croaked. No one will defend me? The young man in row 4 leaned forward. You defended nothing but your own arrogance. Now you face it alone. The captain gave a sharp nod toward the galley. You are relieved of duty. Sit down. Her knees wavered as she obeyed, sinking into an empty seat near the back of first class. For the first time since the flight began, she was silent. The passengers exhaled as though a storm had passed, the tension lifting from their shoulders. The elderly woman opened her journal once more. The cracked leather cover glowed faintly under. The cabin light as she wrote a single line, her hand steady. The young mother leaned slightly, catching just enough of the ink to whisper it to her child. Respect should not be a luxury seat. It should be the ground we all walk on. The plane glided smoothly now, the turbulence replaced with calm. But everyone knew the true turbulence was yet to come. For when they landed, the story of what had happened on this flight would not remain in the air. The attendant's fall was complete, but the revelation of who this woman truly was, that remained for the landing, and with every mile closer to the runway, anticipation swelled like a rising tide. The descent began with a soft chime, the captain's calm voice echoing through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll soon begin our final approach. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. The hum of the engines lowered, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal the city sprawling below, its lights twinkling like constellations scattered across the earth. Inside, silence stretched. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of anticipation. The elderly woman sat perfectly composed, her hands resting atop her journal. Every now and then, her fingers brushed against the cracked leather as if it carried more than words. History, legacy, truth. The disgraced attendant sat 3 rows back, shoulders hunched, her face pale under streaks of dried mascara. The arrogance that once carried her now weighed her down like an anchor. She did not look up. Passengers exchanged hushed whispers. She must be someone important. Did you hear what she said about her husband? About building the airline? Who is she? The businessman leaned forward, whispering to the Pearls woman. Mark my words. When we land, the world will know her name. The cabin crew avoided her eyes, moving stiffly as they completed final checks, but even their steps betrayed unease, as if each footfall echoed guilt. The young mother held her child close, whispering softly. Remember her, sweetheart. Remember how she carried herself. The child asked in a small voice, Is she a queen? Her mother smiled faintly. Something greater. The engine shifted, the nose angling downward. The runway lights emerged, glowing lines stretching into infinity. The cabin tightened its grip on expectation, and then impact. The wheels struck. The ground with a powerful thud, the roar of contact vibrating through every rib and bone. The plane surged forward, brakes hissing, until it slowed into a graceful roll. But the true landing was yet to come. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Passengers, Stirred, but no one stood. All eyes turned to the elderly woman, as if instinctively waiting. The captain stepped out of the cockpit, his cap in hand, his expression solemn. He walked the aisle slowly until he reached her seat. Then, in a gesture no one expected, he bowed. "Madam," he said, his voice steady though his throat tightened. "On behalf of this airline, I extend my deepest apologies. I failed to protect you. But more than that, I failed to honor you." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Cameras rose, passengers recording every word. The woman remained still, her gaze steady. Then, with quiet authority, she rose to her feet. Her presence filled the cabin instantly, small in frame, aged in years, yet towering in dignity. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, sealed with a golden emblem. She placed it on the tray in front of her seat. Her voice carried, strong, unwavering. "For too long, respect has been treated as a luxury, something offered to the rich, the powerful, or the well-dressed. But respect is not a privilege. It is the baseline of humanity. Today, that truth was tested in this cabin." Her eyes scanned the rows, landing briefly on each passenger, before pausing on the attendant cowering in the back. "You failed me," she said, not with anger, but with clarity. "But more importantly, you failed yourselves, because when arrogance speaks, silence becomes its accomplice." A heavy stillness settled, broken only by the faint whir of the cooling engines. She opened the envelope, pulling out a single document, a share certificate stamped with the airline's crest. Bold letters declared ownership, majority stake. She lifted it for all to see. "I do not fly this airline because I bought a ticket," she said. "I fly it because I own it." The words landed harder than the wheels on the runway. The attendant gasped audibly, her hands clutching the armrests, her face drained of all color. Passengers broke into murmurs, some stunned, others smiling in awe. The captain bowed deeper. The crew lowered their heads. The businessman exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She bought the airline," the Pearls woman whispered almost to herself. "We sat in judgment of her, and she sat in judgment of us." The elderly woman placed the certificate back in her envelope, then tucked it into her journal. Her voice softened, but it carried to the last row. "This airline bears the sweat of my people, the brilliance of my husband, and the future of my children's children. Never again will arrogance strip dignity from its passengers. Not while I live, not while my name remains etched in its foundation." Applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous, a release of guilt, awe, respect. Passengers clapped until their palms stung, some even standing in reverence. The young mother lifted her child higher so she could see. "There," she whispered. "That's what a queen looks like." The child nodded, eyes wide. The elderly woman turned toward the attendant. "One last time. Your arrogance brought shame upon yourself, not me. Learn from it, or remain grounded." The attendant bowed her head, tears falling freely now, with no defense left. The woman gathered her bag, her journal tucked safely inside, and stepped toward the exit. Each passenger moved aside, as though parting a path for royalty. The captain himself opened the door, standing tall but humbled. As she passed, he said, "Thank you for reminding us what it means to fly with honor." She gave a single nod, then stepped onto the jet bridge, her figure framed against the light beyond. The passengers followed slowly, still buzzing with the weight of what they had witnessed. They would carry this story beyond the airport, beyond the runway, beyond the sky itself. For this was no ordinary flight. This was the day arrogance collapsed and dignity soared.